All right, we are continuing our story in Daniel this morning. And so as we have been doing, we're going to read the whole chapter of Daniel chapter 6. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. The king planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no charge of corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." So the administrators and satraps went together to the king, and they said, "May King Darius live forever." All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, advisors, and governors, have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document, so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the law, the written edict. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. "Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "As a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable." Then they replied to the king, "Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day." As soon as the king pleased, he set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Then these men went together to the king and said to him, "You know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of the dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. "Daniel, servant of the living God," the king said, "has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And then Daniel spoke with the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. And also before you, your majesty, I have not done harm." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. Then the king gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den. They, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who lived on the whole earth, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion, people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. This is the word of God. Good morning. My name is Kevin Perry, and I get the pleasure of serving here alongside Joel, pastor for preaching and oversight. And I am your pastor for shepherding. And if I have not met you yet, then I would like that to change soon. So catch me after the service. I have actually been gathering with a local body of believers since I was negative 9 months old. It all started right there with her. And so I sat in church. Now I'm nearly 59, so I think it's safe to say that I've listened to a whole lot of Bible stories. Now the thing is, those Bible stories, what went in always didn't come out exactly like it should have. See, because my parents were a little amused when I came home from kindergarten or whatever it was. I went to church kindergarten. So it was either there or Sunday school, vacation Bible school, something. I came home telling the story of Zacchaeus. And they thought this was really good. You know, I had pretty much paraphrased it, had it memorized, and I would tell the story of Zacchaeus for a little while. Now, my mom finally quit asking me to tell this story after a bridge party one night of some of the folks from the church had all come over, and she said, "Kevin, tell the story of Zacchaeus." And like any good pastor, I was faithful to the text up to a point. But when Jesus looked up and saw Zacchaeus in the tree, what I quoted him as saying is, "Zacchaeus, you come down out of that tree before you fall and break your leg." Now, I was obviously mixing some things I had heard in with that story, and maybe I was tired of telling it. So I didn't get asked to perform that anymore. But that wasn't the last time I came away from a Bible story without the full truth of the gospel. Until my early 40s, my understanding of most Bible stories was that I either needed to be like someone or I needed to not be like someone. So when I listened to the story of David, I decided I need to be like David when he killed Goliath. And I don't need to be like David when he met that woman Bathsheba. In fact, I need to be like Noah when he obeyed and built an ark. And I need to not be like Noah when he planted a vineyard, got drunk off his own wine. I needed to be like Peter when he confessed that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the Savior of the world. And I needed to not be like Peter when he denied Jesus 3 times. In this passage this morning, what I had concluded, because I've heard it many, many times, is I needed to be like Daniel. I needed to have the integrity of Daniel. And I needed to not be like his enemies who end up in midair eaten by lions. I am very thankful that over the course of these years, the Spirit has used godly and gospel-centered men and women to open my eyes to the shortcomings of a view of Scripture that is pretty much just morality. This view has been replaced by the hope and the joy and the peace of discovering that the Bible's been pointing to Jesus from Genesis to Revelation. I pray that this morning God helps us to continue to see that Jesus' incarnation, his life, his burial, his death, and his resurrection, this is God's rescue mission. This is his rescue mission to the world that he loves and to the only way to eternal life with him. See, I've not really ever met anybody that doesn't like a good rescue story. And they all got different opinions about who should get rescued. But most everybody likes a rescue story. The news media flock anytime there's an amazing rescue. If you're watching a movie and, the hero rushes in at the last minute and saves the day and rescues, we love that. In fact, whether it's fictional or truth-based, these are fan favorites. And you think about it, the books that have been written all the way back in time, all of them have heroes. And when people get rescued, everybody gets excited. So here's the thing. The stories that I've heard have filled my mind with vivid imagery. But in my childhood, I didn't quite remember Daniel the way the story is actually told. Let me tell you how I remember Daniel. So Daniel's this really young guy, and he's cast into a lion's den by this really mean king because he wouldn't bow down to the king's statue. Okay, if you've been here a few weeks, you know that I'm mixing stuff up. He's saved because God sends this powerful angel who in my childhood mind, I could see him with this lion under his arm, with his hand clapped around his mouth. And like a cat, if you held a cat that way, his legs are just clawing and scrambling, trying to get away from him the whole time. The lion's just sitting there, the angel's just sitting there cool as a cucumber. And the whole time, Daniel is over in the corner, and he is praying. He's praying hard. He's petitioning God because he is scared. He's trembling. And he looks like he's about 25 years old, okay? And so then finally, in the morning, the bad guys finally go, well, I can't get that lions to eat him. I guess we're going to have to let him out. All right. And so they do. So here's the lesson I took away from that. If I pray really hard and I pray a lot, even when somebody with a lot of authority tells me I can't, if I'll do that, then God will rescue me from the bad guys. See, that was the moral to my story. I was obviously mixing a few stories. Okay, maybe I had seen them on a flannel graph and they didn't quite, fit the way this text is. And as I have been reminded, this ancient way in which I speak sometimes when I refer to flannel graphs and hurricane parties sometimes needs explanation, okay? So let's just say that flannel graphs was the visual way of showing people a story when you were my age and I was young. And if you don't know what that is or anything, Joel, you can go ask your grandmother, okay? So today I want us to walk back through the story of Daniel in chapter 6, and I want us to correct some of my childhood misunderstandings as we go. And I want to look for how this parallels and foreshadows Jesus' experience. So you can follow along in Daniel. They'll also have it on the screen. I am going to refer to the verses in Daniel. I'm not going to reread them because that's what we just got finished doing. I'm also not going to go to the New Testament and read all those references. And for my note takers out there, I promise we will get this added to the application guide on the app so that you can get it. So if you miss one, don't worry about it. So we're going to kind of go through the things that are similar in these stories rather quickly here. All right, so obviously, this is Darius' reign, so Daniel is not a young guy. He's an old guy, probably in his 80s. And unlike my childhood version, we have no record that he was upset, fearful, or even that he prayed in the lion's den. So let's look at what we do know. And before we get to today's text, I want to go back to something that we learned in Daniel chapter 1. You remember we told that he's from the royal lineage of the house of Judah. That's part of the reason he got hauled off in the first place. And so in Daniel 1:3, we find that information. If you go to Matthew chapter 1, you can find the lineage of Christ, which quite obviously goes back through the line of Judah. And then the Matthew as a book itself, one of the biggest points of the whole book is that Jesus is king overall. All right, so you can find that there too. In verse 3, we're told that Daniel has this extraordinary spirit. Well, both are to be set over the realm. Both Daniel's to be set over the whole realm. We also know that Christ has been set over all. See, Jesus is the only person that has ever walked this earth in perfect step with the Spirit the whole way. So to say he's full of the Spirit would be putting it mildly. You can go take a look at Colossians 1. Gives this beautiful description of Christ and his lordship over all creation. In verse 4, both are attacked by conspiracy, and this conspiracy is motivated by jealousy. Daniel has the other administrators who are upset because he's going to be the one put over everything. Jesus by the Jewish leadership. And you can find that in 27th chapter of Matthew. In verse 5, both are blameless. So the enemies look for accusations that concern their God. Well, in both instances, the enemies don't come up with anything that they can actually say other than something about their God. Now, for Daniel's enemies, they were pointing that it was in conflict with King Darius. And the Jews, surprisingly, and it's embarrassing almost as a Jew if you read this Matthew chapter 27, where they just basically admit, no, there's only one king and it's Caesar. These are supposed to be God followers, saying that there's only one king and it's Caesar. Both of these guys are blameless, both Jesus and Daniel. In fact, in Luke 20, the Jews kept trying to catch Jesus, trip him up, just like the administrators were trying to trip up Daniel. And in Luke 20, it actually records an instance where after coming to Jesus and being frustrated yet again, the Jews just said, we quit. We're not asking any more. We're not asking any more questions. We just get embarrassed. Every time we ask him a question, he comes up with something that we can't see coming, and we look stupid. So let's just stop. So Daniel's enemies are actually forced to concoct a law. A law, keep in mind, remember, based on a lie. Because when they came to Darius and told him, hey, everybody's agreed, Daniel didn't agree. Daniel was one of the administrators, and he had not agreed to this. So they set it up based on a lie. Now, the Romans already had a law, that Caesar was king only. And so the Jews basically said, well, what Jesus is doing is pointing at another king besides Caesar. In verses 10 and 11, Daniel petitions and implores God 3 times in his home. I mean, think about it. Those guys who went to catch Daniel doing this, they didn't just wait and watch him get up and do his morning prayer. They hung out there through the entire day and watched him do morning and noon and afternoon prayer before they finally got around to going and telling the king. And Jesus, likewise, petitions God 3 times in the Garden of Gethsemane. That was when he sweated the drops of blood as he was so torn over the cup that he was getting ready to drink. Now, I want to pause in our comparison here just a minute, because there's this very convicting realization that I realized reading this. I want you to look at verse 10. It says, just as he had done before, referring to his prayer. Daniel's obedience to God did not seek to communicate defiance to Darius. He saw no need to declare his defiance to continue his obedience. He'd been doing it all along. He just kept doing exactly what he'd always done. He did not go find a platform to broadcast his rights. He was just faithful as he'd always been. See, I was taking note. Daniel's integrity is not boastful at all. It doesn't seek to draw attention to itself. He was doing this at home. I don't know where those guys had to go sit that they could see in his upper window. But Daniel was not trying to splash this everywhere. See, I find that when ungodly authorities have told me that I have to do something, or I can't do something, unfortunately, what I find is my flesh rising up. You can't tell me what to do. I know what my rights are. So I put my piety on like a shield, and I say, this is my right. And then sometimes it's embarrassing. Sometimes I actually start doing something I wasn't even doing before they said anything about it. That's just ugly. I wasn't even doing it, but I started doing it when you told me I couldn't. And so in the end, does it really say anything about my heart's posture towards God? Is that what it's about? Or is it me just trying to prove something to the world around me? All right, back to our comparison. Look in verse 14. Darius, and I want to call on your memory here, Darius and Pilate both knew that the person they were looking at was innocent. And they tried really hard to get him released. If you go look in John 19, you'll see where Pilate was trying to do the same thing Darius was. Darius worked all the way to evening trying to get him released. Daniel and Jesus were both sentenced, and the sentences were carried out. Daniel into the literal lion's den, and when Jesus went to the cross, it was metaphorical lions. And this I do want to read you here from Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is a psalm written by David But the amazing thing is, almost 1,000 years before Christ came, it describes crucifixion. And it describes it long before crucifixion itself was ever invented. And what you hear is you hear Jesus' agony, what he was feeling, what he was thinking on the cross. And so this is the psalm starts with what he declared from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? But in verse 13, this is what it says. They opened their mouths against me, lions mauling and roaring. And then in verse 21, he cries out, save me from the lion's mouth. Now this is metaphorical language, but it's similar. They were both facing lions. In verse 17, stones were rolled in place and they were secured with the king's seal. In Matthew chapter 7 talks about how the stone that was rolled in front of Jesus' tomb was sealed by the Romans. Daniel and Darius and Pilate were greatly disturbed. One of the, obviously we've got the story of why Darius was what he did and the fact that he stayed up all night, couldn't eat. And in John 19, we actually find out that at one point Pilate says he was more afraid than ever. Now, this is a Roman soldier, and he's scared. He may have wished that in Matthew chapter 27, his wife actually sends him a message. And he may very well have wished later on that he had followed what his wife said, because she says, listen, I've had a dream, and it's bad news. You need to stay away from this innocent man. So she knew he was innocent. And then in verse 23, early in the morning, when the stones are rolled away, Daniel and Jesus are alive. Both Daniel and Jesus, emerging from their death sentences, causes a proclamation of the living God to go out through all the world. Verses 25 and 27 in Daniel. And then if you look in Philippians chapter 2, you'll see the same description about what Christ caused. It says, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. See, I can believe to say it's clear that the similarities in Daniel's experience foreshadow and point to Jesus' arrest, his trial, his sentencing, his crucifixion, his burial, and his resurrection. But what's the purpose of Old Testament stories pointing to Christ? Well, see, if I stopped just with the story of Daniel, if we just took that in a vacuum, then I got to admit, it's a great rescue story. It makes for, very good reading, and it gives lots of exciting imagery. But I would still really find it very tough to apply it to my life. I mean, I got to be honest, Daniel's kind of a unicorn. I mean, this guy's just good from the beginning of the story all the way to the end. We don't ever see Daniel running from God or doing anything particularly bad. That's hard to live up to. See, my childhood conclusion, remember, was that God rescues the good guys. The problem is I'm not one. I've blown it a lot. I haven't been faithful to God. I don't always eat right. I have become entranced by shiny things in this world. I've bowed down to modern day idols. I have often made it all about me, and I've taken credit for the talents and the blessings that God has given me. I've caved into fear, peer pressure, people in authority, and in doing so, I have forsaken my fellowship with God. See, I haven't even come close to following even the first 10 rules that God gave the Jews. Where does it leave me if the goal to this whole thing is to be like Daniel Where is my hope when I realize that I got more in common with Daniel's enemies than I do with Daniel? I've really enjoyed studying and discovering the details of how these stories are the same. But I've also realized that my greatest hope and joy in the story of Daniel lies in what is different. As a child, the impact on Daniel's enemies was not shown in the flannel graph stories. I didn't see that at Vacation Bible School. As children, my teachers didn't spend a whole lot of time describing what it looks like when people are thrown and their bones are all crushed before they ever hit the bottom floor. You know, I've never seen a flannel graph of the gory outcome of lions eating humans. See, if you were going to make a movie out of this and you did the scene with any semblance of reality, you've just earned yourself an R rating. This is brutal. Look at verse 24. Daniel's enemies get exactly what they deserve. Yeah, we love our rescue stories. But you know, in those rescue stories, there's usually bad guys. And inwardly, at the end, we kind of cheer. I mean, we're pretty happy when the bad guys get what's coming. When the evil that they have dished out on everybody else comes back and lands right in their lap. But where does it leave us when we realize that we're the bad guys? If the human story was fair, if fair was what it was all about, it could have been really, really short. God creates humans, and he gives them one rule. Humans break God's rule. Humans are cast out, separated for eternity from God. The end. I mean, the Bible could have ended with chapter 3 of Genesis. I'm done. I only gave you one rule. You couldn't even follow that. But then throughout the Bible, I love this, when you see these two little words together. But God. But God so loved the world that had sinned against him, the world that did not return his love. They made for themselves idols. They misused his name. They refused to rest in him. They dishonored their parents, murdered, committed adultery, stole, lied, and coveted. He loved this world so much that he gave his only Son so that everyone who believes in him would not suffer eternal separation from him, but have the life that is really life forever with him. See, in Daniel's story, the bad guys get what they deserve. Daniel doesn't die. He's not even injured. He doesn't even suffer any pain that we're told of. You see, in the ultimate story, Jesus is mocked and he's spit on. He's tortured. And he does die. He, the only innocent one who has ever lived, he took exactly what the bad guys deserved. But then, Sunday morning, he rises from the dead and he does the unthinkable. He embraces us. The bad guys. The ones whose sins nailed him to the cross. And then he gives us life forever with him when we receive what he bought for us. You see, in Daniel's story, I'm a rebel against God. I'm thrown into a pit and I get exactly what I deserve. And in God's story, the one that every epic tale since then is based on, Jesus takes all that I deserve, he destroys it, he defeats death, he rises from the grave, and then he gives me what I definitely don't deserve. Sonship, adoption, an heir with him, eternity with the Father and the Son and the Spirit and all those who belong to them. No more crying, except tears of joy. No more pain, knowing fully, even as I am fully known. Now that is the ultimate rescue story.